There are careers that end with a final curtain, and there are careers that end with nothing. No announcement, no farewell, just a gradual fading that nobody quite names out loud. Tom Jones's career in the mid-1980s was ending the second way. Not dramatically, not publicly, not with any single moment that could be pointed to afterward as the turning point. It was ending the way things end in the music industry, when the world simply moves on, through the accumulation of unreturned calls, through bookings at venues smaller than the ones before them, through the particular silence of a radio that plays everything except your name. He was not broke, he was not invisible. His name still carried weight in certain rooms, and people who had grown up with his records still knew who he was. But knowing who someone was and making space for them in the present tense were two different things, and the music world of the mid-1980s was not especially interested in making space for a voice that had been famous in the 1960s. The charts had changed, the sounds had changed, the machinery of the industry, the producers, the label executives, the people who decided what got heard and what didn't, had reorganized itself around a new set of values, and Tom Jones's voice, powerful as it remained, did not fit cleanly into any of the categories those values recognized. He kept working. That was the part that people who only knew the surface of the story often missed. The engagements continued, the suits were pressed, the voice was warmed up every night before the lights came up, and cooled down every night after they went off. There were venues in Europe where Tom Jones remained a significant draw. Places where the pop and soul records of the 1960s and 1970s had a different relationship to time, where an audience that had grown up with those sounds still turned out in large numbers for the performers who had made them. In those rooms, Tom was not a faded star navigating a difficult period. He was simply Tom Jones, the man who had been performing with full commitment since his early 20s, who had never learned to do it any other way, and who, on the nights when the room was right, could still do something to the air inside it that very few performers on earth were capable of doing. He kept working. That was the part that people who only knew the surface of the story often missed. But there is a particular kind of professional endurance that resembles hope from the outside and feels like something more complicated from the inside. And Tom, in those years, was living deep inside that complication. The difficulty was not financial. It was not even, in any simple sense, about fame. It was about something more fundamental. The growing uncertainty about whether the voice that had defined his life, the instrument he had spent 4 decades developing, trusting, and offering to anyone who would listen, still had a place in the world that was being built around it. The 1960s had made him. The 1970s had confirmed him. And somewhere in the passage through the 1980s, without anyone quite meaning for it to happen, the world had begun to treat him as a monument rather than a musician. A monument is respected. A monument is preserved. A monument is pointed to as evidence that something important once happened here. But monuments do not evolve. They do not surprise. They do not walk into a room and change the temperature. And Tom Jones, whatever else he was, had spent his entire life being the person who walked into rooms and changed their temperature. And the gradual awareness that this was no longer what the industry expected from him was a particular kind of loss that had no clean language for itself. There was also, in those years, a particular quality to the silence that Tom found more difficult than the noise of failure would have been. Failure is legible, It has a shape, a cause, a set of explanations that can be examined and addressed. What Tom was experiencing in the mid-1980s was not failure in any conventional sense. The shows were not disasters, the audiences were not hostile. The reviews, when they came, were not unkind. What was happening was something quieter and more difficult to argue against. A slow withdrawal of attention that was not about anything he was doing wrong, but simply about the music world's movement towards something else. You cannot adjust to a problem that nobody will name. And the industry, in those years, was not naming it. The irony was not lost on Tom or on the people close to him who watched the mid-1980s unfold. He was, by any objective measure, a better performer in his mid-40s than he had been in his mid-20s. The instrument had deepened. The understanding of how to use it had grown more precise. The recklessness of the early years had been replaced not by caution, but by a kind of conscious mastery. The ability to make a calculated choice in the middle of a song and execute it exactly, to give a room more than it expected without tipping into excess, to pace a performance over 2 hours so that the final 30 minutes felt like an arrival rather than a conclusion. None of that development had stopped. None of it had been lost. It was simply waiting in those quiet years for the world to turn back toward it. Then, in 1988, something unexpected happened. The Art of Noise were a British electronic group, experimental, forward-looking, the kind of act that occupied a very different corner of the music world than the one Tom Jones had built his career in. They wanted to record a cover of Prince's Kiss, and they wanted Tom Jones to sing it. The call, when it came, arrived without the weight of ceremony. It was a professional inquiry from people who had decided, for reasons that were not immediately obvious to anyone in Tom's circle, that his voice was exactly what their version of the song required. Not a nostalgia act, not a legacy booking, not a request to be the heritage guest on someone else's project, a genuine creative request, one artist reaching out to another because they heard something specific and wanted it. Tom said yes. The decision was not agonized over. It did not require lengthy deliberation or the consultation of advisors. It was simply the response of a performer who had been waiting through several years of diminishing returns for someone to ask him to do something genuinely interesting, and who recognized, when the question was finally posed, that interesting was exactly what it was. What happened in that recording session was not what anyone had predicted. The combination of Tom's voice, that voice, the one that had filled Vegas showrooms and Welsh valleys and living rooms across 2 continents, with the synthesized, angular, defiantly modern production of the Art of Noise, produced something that nobody in the room had quite imagined before the tape started rolling. The song was released in 1988, and it did something that Tom Jones's name had not done in years. It appeared on radio stations that had never played him before. It reached audiences who knew his name only as a piece of their parents' record collection, and who suddenly found themselves listening to him as if encountering an entirely new voice. The response was not simply positive. It was disorienting for the industry, for critics, and in some ways, most of all, for Tom himself. The critical apparatus that had been in the process of constructing a respectful but terminal narrative about his career, the legacy artist framing, the gentle diminishment that positions a performer as important historically while implying that the important part is over, did not know quite what to do with a Tom Jones who was suddenly appearing on playlists alongside acts a generation younger than him, being described not as a veteran making a late career cameo, but as a genuinely contemporary presence. Some critics adjusted quickly, others never quite managed it. But audiences who had no institutional investment in the version of Tom Jones that was supposed to be winding down made the adjustment effortlessly. The version of him that the music world had been in the process of quietly filing away had just been retrieved by people 30 years younger than his original audience, and found to be not a relic, but a resource, something that could be used, combined, transformed, made part of a conversation that was happening right now. He had not changed. His voice had not changed. What had changed was the frame around him, and the change in the frame had revealed something that the previous frame had been obscuring. That the instrument Tom Jones had spent his life developing was not a period piece. It was not a museum artifact. It was, simply and stubbornly, a great voice. And great voices did not have expiration dates. The years that followed built on that shift. Not immediately and not without effort. A single successful collaboration did not erase the momentum of a decade's quiet decline, and Tom was too experienced in the realities of the industry to mistake a promising moment for a guaranteed trajectory. But the Art of Noise record had done something structural. It had demonstrated, in terms the industry understood, that Tom Jones's voice was not a closed chapter. It was available. It was functional. It was, when placed in the right context, still capable of doing something that other voices could not replicate. And once that demonstration had been made, it could not be unmade. The work with the Art of Noise opened doors that had been closed for a decade, not because Tom had been away, but because the industry had stopped looking in his direction. Suddenly it looked again, and what it found was a performer who had continued to work through the silence, who had not used the quiet years as an excuse to coast, who was, in every technical and musical sense, better than he had ever been. The comeback, if the word could even be applied to someone who had never actually stopped, culminated in 1999 with Sex Bomb, recorded with the German producer Moose T. The song was absurd in the best possible sense, playful, self-aware, built on a groove that belonged entirely to the present tense, performed by a 60-year-old man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the alternative to evolving was a kind of slow disappearance that he was not prepared to accept. It reached number 3 in the United Kingdom. It introduced Tom Jones to a third generation of listeners who had no memory of It's Not Unusual, or Delilah, or the Las Vegas years, or the television program. To them, he was not a heritage act who had made a comeback. He was simply a performer, vital, present, still capable of surprise. But for those who had watched the arc from the beginning, who had been there for the early years, the peak years, and the quiet years in between, the comeback meant something that was harder to put into a chart position. It meant that the man who had refused to accept the industry's conclusion about his relevance had been right, that the voice that had never stopped developing had found in the end audiences in every decade willing to receive it. That the gradual fading of the mid-1980s had not been an ending, but a transition, one that required, more than anything else, the patience to keep working through the silence without knowing when or whether the silence would ever lift. In later years, Tom Jones spoke occasionally about the art of noise period, not with the triumphalism of someone recounting a comeback, but with the quieter tone of someone describing a moment of recognition that had come from an unexpected direction. He had simply been working, he would say. He had been doing what he always did, and then something happened that reminded him, and reminded everyone watching, that the work had not been wasted. The phone rang. He answered it, and the conversation that followed turned out to be one of the most important of his career, not because of who was calling, but because of what the call proved, that the voice he had spent his entire working life trusting had been right to trust, and that the wider world, given enough time and the right circumstances, would eventually agree. What those long, underestimated, quiet years had required of Tom Jones was not reinvention. It was something harder than that. It was the willingness to keep going without external confirmation that going forward made any sense at all. To perform for smaller rooms without treating them as lesser rooms. To give the same voice to every engagement, whether the engagement seemed to warrant it or not. To remain through years that offered no particular external reason for it, a musician rather than a monument. And when the moment finally came, when the art of noise called, and then the world called, and then an entire new generation heard his name for the first time and decided to stay, Tom Jones was ready. Not because he had been waiting, but because he had never, not for a single night in those long, quiet years, stopped preparing.